Welcome Brian McHale, Arts and Humanities Distinguished Professor at The Ohio State University. Welcome, Brian.
Thank you, Frederick. It's great to be here, wherever here is.
Yes. So Brian, like a question a lot of us might have is, how did a kid from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania end up writing, researching, creating, helping establish this field of narrative, narratology, narrative theory? Yeah, how did that happen?
Okay, can I say first, I'm so happy to see those covers of those books here. I'm really proud of them, the artwork on them, and it's good to see them in front of me. Makes me feel warm and fuzzy. Okay, everybody's backstory always involves that key person or that succession of key people who sort of throw you on another track. So when I was an undergraduate at Brown University, there was a English academic called Roger Fowler who was there as a visiting professor one semester, and he was a stylistician, which I didn't know, what that could possibly be. Took a seminar with him, and he got me thinking about style and about linguistics and its usefulness to talk about literature. It felt like he showed me a whole new toolkit. So I aspired to do that, and I got a scholarship to go to the UK, to Oxford, and studied with a stylistician there called Stephen Ullman, one of the old school European polymath literary scholars, and a stylistician who died of heart disease while I was his student. And I got taken over by a former student of his, Jonathan Culler, who happened to be at Oxford at that time. So there's three names, one after the other, set me in a slightly different direction, but also at the same time kept me on track, thinking about form, about language, and I found my way to what I thought was a really promising and engaging case study, which was the American modernist novelist John Dos Passos, whom I read. I really dove into it, and from Dos Passos, a modernist, maybe the greatest modernist whose name we've forgotten among the Americans. From there, it's not obvious how you get to postmodernism, but again, it's an accident. A fellow student of mine handed me a novel by Thomas Pynchon, a post-war novelist. His historical novel V, and then I moved on to his later historical novel Gravity's Rainbow. And I looked at those and I thought, they're similar in ambition and in their historical scope and in their immersiveness to John Dos Passos, but on all these other scales and measures, they're different. How to account for the difference? What's new about the way Pynchon does fiction compared to the way Dos Passos did fiction? And that got me started, right? So how is this later thing of the 60s and 70s different from this modernist thing that I'd spent so much time thinking about and reading and rereading? And at the same time, I couldn't imagine that Pynchon was unique, that he wasn't out there all on his own. There must be other kinds of writing, other writers who are similar to him in some ways. So I began to collect those and to then ask the questions, so what's similar among these writers and what's different between them and the modernists who came before? It's, in other words, a case study in change and difference over time. And I was able to identify some other writers, some other kinds of writing in Pynchon's generation, his contemporaries, that seemed like him, but then how to describe the likeness. So the French novelists of the new novel period, or the other Americans, the metafictional writers like Coover and Barth and Nabokov, or the Latin American writers of the boom, like Garcia Marquez or Carlos Fuentes. They seem to have some things in common with Pynchon, but also to be distinct. So what categories or what umbrellas could I group them under that allow me to capture their sameness and also their difference from the modernists who came before? So that's what gets me into the whole issue of postmodernism and its distinctiveness, its difference from modernism. Right?
So a series of kind of happenstances and kind of right place, right time with folks like color. Of course, the scholarship that you got was a Rhodes Scholarship, which is not any scholarship.
That's true.
And you did get it, and you got your DPhil. You went from there to Israel, right? Is that correct? Am I getting that right?
That's right. And that's another of those stories where Jonathan Culler had met Benjamin Haroshovsky, the Israeli scholar, at the Hebrew Center in Oxford, and he introduced us. And Haroshovsky said, you want to come and be a research assistant for a couple of years? And I said, I've got currently nothing better to do. Nobody else is offering me jobs, so I went. And finished writing my dissertation while I was in Tel Aviv, and was his research assistant and organized his off-prints and his library, and was there at the moment when he wanted to launch an English language journal. There had always been a Hebrew language journal at Tel Aviv University, edited by Haroshovsky and his circle, the sort of Tel Aviv scholars of poetics, a journal called Hasifrut, and then he started an English language journal, short-lived, called Poetics and Theory of Literature, and when that folded after a couple of years, he launched another one called Poetics Today.
A cliffhanger, our cliffhanger.
There we go. We'll get back to Poetics Today later, but that's how the Israeli connection came, and that's how I got exposed to all of this Israeli tradition of literary scholarship, which was, which tapped into the really deep roots of Eastern and Central European literary scholarship.
So this nicely leads us into the big question, I guess, narrative theory as a kind of big key for you to unlock these kind of this transnational literary kind of republic or space, right, of a kind of fiction that's happening that has similarities but differences. Why narrative theory?
So here's the thing. It seems to me that different eras or periods of literary practice amplify and foreground different parts of narrative, which are captured by different parts of narrative theory. Right? If we're talking about the modernist era, my starting point in my career, what's crucial is to talk about what in narrative theory we call focalization and narration. In other words, who sees, who speaks, the sort of transmission of information, the transmission of narrative inside a fiction. Those are the things you want most to grasp when you're looking at modernist narratives like Dos Passos or Faulkner or Virginia Woolf. When you come to the postmodernists, you could use all those tools, but they won't necessarily take you to the most interesting and distinctive thing about postmodernism. Instead, you want to be using tools that give you access to world building and actually world unbuilding, which happens a lot in postmodernist fiction. So you need the tools or you need the categories of narrative theory that allow you to grasp the world building aspect of narratives. So you want to talk about possible worlds theory, and you want to go to a different range of theorists and their toolkit. So it seems to me that what narrative theory in the breadth of its scope allows you to do is to adjust and fine tune the toolkit to accommodate different kinds of writing, different periods of writing, and to be responsive to the differences.
Thank you, Brian. You just kind of illuminated decades of my kind of, thinking in the area, especially what is this key that we use all the time in our work called narrative theory or narratology? So if you were now looking back at your career and even looking forward, is there, I don't know, a worldview, an approach? Is there a singular question that you're asking? Is there a kind of end goal in mind, maybe a unified theory? Or, what is the Brian McHale research program?
I'm not sure about unified or fully unified, but it all starts on that question about change and difference, and change and difference as driven by form, the history of form, right? Change of and difference, of course, is also driven by the change of the world around the writers. The writers are always responsive to their world, and so the difference between the world of the modernists and the world of the postmodernists, that's important. That's something that also drives them. But at the same time, form changes, not exactly independently of the world, but as they say, semi-autonomously, at a different rate, or it doesn't sync up. The changes in form don't necessarily sync up directly with the changes in the world. There is an internal mechanism in literary history, many internal mechanisms, that drive change and drive things forward. So that's the overarching question. How do you get from point A to point B when point A and point B are different forms? How do you get from the modernist form of narrative to the postmodernist form? And then, the various fallouts from asking that set of questions. There's always more to be explored. There's always leftovers, right? So for instance, after I had written 2 books about postmodernist fiction, I realized I hadn't said anything about poetry, and poetry was really interesting, and the differences were really striking between modernist and postmodernist poetry. I'd better try and think about that. I'd better try and think about ways of capturing that difference as well. It's not as clear cut, and it's there's a lot of moving parts. But the initial set of research questions about change keep giving birth to new questions, and that's what I've been really tracking all this time, right?
Speaking of all of the things that you're doing in your research and the approach or the questions that you have that you're constantly tackling, and the kinds of new objects of study that you're sort of taking in, how does this find its way into the classroom for you?
Right. I have the sense that students, the students that I encounter, are actually hungry for tools, right? They have intuitions and they have interests, but I have the sense they sometimes feel frustrated that they don't have the tools to express those intuitions or to extend those intuitions, right? And it seems to me narrative theory is a toolkit we can help them acquire to feed that hunger, to give them ways to talk about the things that interest them, the objects that interest them, the arts that interest them, and to share their insights with each other, so the tools are held in common by everybody in the class, and also to find things that they wouldn't have been able to find without the toolkit. So this is really about giving them the capacity, the tools, to talk about the literary works and the art forms that interests them. It's not the only toolkit they could be equipped with, but in my experience, it's a good one. It's it's flexible, it's powerful, it's handy, and I think the students find it that way too, right? They can actually, by the end of a semester, pack up their toolkit and take it out of the class with them, and go to work on other stuff with their tools. So I try, even in classes that are not specifically about narrative or about narrative theory, classes like introductory surveys or the course I teach on science fiction, I try to make sure that some of what we do is about assembling and replenishing their toolkit, right? And even if it's not, the central aspect of a particular course, it is something that they can take away with them anyway.
Yeah, that's great. Is there, you said even if it's not central, in other words, they probably don't have like a reading from narrative theory, but it's in the background. Right. Is there, I don't know, let's take your science fiction class. Is there something that has proven over and over again to be something as like the Brian McHale go-to for narrative theory in these spaces or in that space?
So you mean a piece of theoretical writing that I would give the students, or one that I would absorb into the class?
One you'd absorb into the class, yeah.
Right, okay. So it is the case that, the way I teach the science fiction class is really colored by my readings in possible worlds theory. And, the science fiction class is at its heart a class about world building, right? Science fiction is distinctive because it is the most self-consciously world building genre. And it's almost a narrative theory in its own right. With just a little extra boost of self-consciousness, it becomes its own narrative theory. It shows us world building right in front of our eyes, so that I bring in the aspects of narrative theory that has to do with world building, and I line them up with the science fiction theories about worlds, about the novum, about cognitive estrangement, these very powerful ideas, which are in their origin indebted to narrative theory and are easy to correlate with narrative theory. So I don't need to use very much of this terminology in order to get the students to see, narratologically into science fiction.
Yeah, wonderful. Yeah. Okay, so you mentioned poetry as something that you were kind of very curious about understanding more, and the long poem in one of your books. So I know this is a lot of, John Ashbery, but how do you read The Skaters in a nutshell, or how would you read a few lines with your kind of approach?
So here's what's attractive about Ashbery, right? So from my experience, and I think this is shared by a lot of people, Ashbery's verse is very attractive, beautiful, but also elusive and frustrating, exasperating, right? He seems to be almost making sense all the time. You almost get it, but you can't quite get it, right? And he also seems to be offering you keys to how to read this poem and then withdrawing the keys. So you think you got a handle on it and then you don't have a handle on it. So that's, for me, part of the attraction of the poem. The frustration is part of the attraction. And one of the things that Ashbery does in The Skaters, in really almost all of his longer poems and all the poems through maybe the end of the 90s, in our century, in his last books, he becomes more of a lyric poet. But in all along, he's been working with a mix of lyric and narrative. These are quasi-narrative poems. There are narrative passages, or there's narrative possibilities for reading these poems. And that's part of the attraction of it for me. It's on again, off again narrative, right? The narrative is there and then it's gone. The poem feels immersive in the way that great novels are immersive, and then it turns a corner and it feels expulsive. It throws you out, right? And it's that give and take between being drawn in, immersed, and being thrown out, alienated, right? That, that's the attraction of the poems, that's the frustration of the poems, and that, it seems to me, is like what Ashbery is after, right? And it's not everybody's cup of tea, but for me, it really works.
Yes, and elsewhere you've done some really great generative kind of conceptual work with the notion of the line break, right? Segmentation and the energy even in the line itself when it breaks. So such great work. The alpha to omega, in a way, for me, thinking about you and your kind of journey, is Poetics Today. So getting us back to that moment when you were in Israel, and then kind of, yeah, maybe that in itself is a journey, right? Poetics
True, true. Right, okay. So I was there at the origin, right? I was on the masthead. I was an assistant to the editor from the first issue of Poetics Today. And throughout the 1980s, when I was still living in Israel, I had various titles, but I was always functioning in some capacity with the journal. And even after I returned to the States in the 90s, I kept up for about 10 years a relationship to the journal. But in the end, there were too many stresses and strains between me and the editor. And so we discontinued. We had a more or less amicable divorce until around 2015, when the journal was in some dire straits, falling behind its publication schedule, and I was asked to step in as an interim, just to get things back on track. So between 2015 and last year, 2019, I edited the journal. Commissioned a bunch of special issues, did all the things you do in order to get back on schedule, to get back into people's consciousness again, to mend some bridges, and hand the thing off in pretty good shape at the end of June 2019 to some new editors, younger generation, 2 women, Milet Shamir in Tel Aviv and Irene Tucker at UC Irvine. So a changing of the guard, and I'm proud that the journal they inherited is sound and intact, and they're now in a position to run with it, and that makes me feel very happy.
Brian, given your sort of history, very kind of material and sort of scholarly history with something like Poetics Today, why is a journal like this so important for maybe defining and growing and complicating a field like narrative theory?
Well, I think it has 2 things going for it, Poetics Today. One is it really does have roots, right? It really comes out of that Tel Aviv group, who in turn drew heavily on all that scholarship from Eastern Europe and Central Europe, from Russian and Polish and German scholarship. And they were deeply imbued with those traditions and carried them on and updated them and advanced them. So the journal is still grounded in that. And that's one thing that it has going for it. And the other thing is, over the years, it has proven to be open to new developments. It's been a kind of home to developments in cognitive narratology, to developments in unnatural narratology. Even when the editor himself, or herself henceforth, is personally skeptical about these developments or has reservations, the journal is still hospitable to them. And I think that's a virtue. And the 2 together the rootedness and the openness make for, I think, a valuable journal, something worth reading.
Yeah, in fact, in many ways speaks to the kind of robustness of the field itself, right?
True, true, right, right.
So what's next for you, Brian?
Well, okay, so I've got two projects, and again, they're kind of spillovers or continuations of things I've been working on all along, and I'm alternating or hesitating between the two of them. One is to continue the research into narrative in poetry. I've published a few papers about that, and I know where the gaps in my knowledge are, and I'm going to try and fill those in. Right now, I want to try and get a handle on that whole tradition of the ballad in English, which is really crucial for the English language tradition of narrative in poetry. So folk ballads, literary ballads, commercial ballads in country music. I want to try and get my head around that. That's in the next step towards a more comprehensive study of narrative in poetry. But at the same time, I'm also currently working on science fiction because I'd been publishing occasionally in scattered ways material on science fiction. And I looked at it one day and thought, it wouldn't take that much to pull all these scattered pieces together and to integrate it all and to make sense of it under one roof. So I'm working on that too. Currently, the science fiction project has sort of edged out the narrative poetry project. But the two of them are going along side by side. And I feel both of them are kind of complementary, adjacent to work I've been doing all along since the 80s.
Brian, this is kind of putting you on the spot here, but if you had any science fiction on your bedstand, and maybe you do, what is that science fiction, or what science fiction right now is interesting to you?
Right, cool. So I looked at the corpus, all the books I'd read and notes I'd taken and things I'd written about, and I realized, and people have pointed this out to me before, it's a little bit skewing male. There's not enough of the women science fiction writers in my corpus. So I set myself down to finish reading the women science fiction writers that I value the most. So I was reading the Ursula Le Guin stories that I'd missed. I'm sitting down now with Joanna Russ. There's a couple more of her novels that I hadn't read before. I finished the last of the Octavia Butler ones that I hadn't read. And N.K. Jemisin is queued up after them. So this is all about filling out the range of my corpus and allowing me to talk with a little bit more authority about the range of science fiction.
Absolutely, yeah, exciting, really exciting. Brian, thank you for unzipping your brain a little bit and sharing your journey. Gosh, so much, the long poem, story world building, science fiction in the classroom, your current work, this Poetics Today, which seems to have kind of been a long part of your kind of career as a scholar and your journey. Thank you, Brian.
Thanks a lot, Frederick. It was a lot of fun.
Okay.
Are you ready to bet?